Good afternoon. My name's Dean Godson. Welcome to Policy Exchange, this very important seminar on strategic trade. Delighted to be able to welcome Advisor to the Board of Trade, Tony Abbott, distinguished former Prime Minister of Australia, who will be in conversation with Charles Moore, biographer of Margaret Thatcher, visiting fellow in Thatcher Studies here at Policy Exchange, and President of the Board of Trade, Right Honourable Liz Truss MP. Tony will deliver a keynote address first, and then be in conversation, and then floor open to questions. Please stick your electronic hands up. Usual Policy Exchange House rules, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation, and looking forward to hearing what all of you have to say. So Tony, thank you again, and look forward once more to having you on our Policy Exchange platform. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Dean, Lord Charles Moore, Secretary of State Liz Truss, it's an honour to be here. And look, there is nothing like some serious pressure to test whether our actions really do match our beliefs. And this pandemic has certainly dispelled any notion that, at least for a rich country, you can always get what you need when you need it from a globalised economy. Like so many, Australia discovered early on just how dependent we were on imports, especially from China, even for PPE as basic as masks. And later, the EU refused us a major shipment of vaccines, ordered and paid for, because it wanted to protect its own people first. There is no doubt that in extremis, it's every country for itself, at least until panic has subsided and judgment has reasserted itself. Hence, this question: to what extent should globalisation, that's countries and people specialising in what's most profitable in an increasingly borderless world, be replaced by a more strategic approach to trade? First, let's be clear, a tariff is just a tax, albeit a tax on imports. Taxes are necessary to pay for the works of government, but they should be as low, simple and efficient as possible, and the impact of a tariff, which makes imported goods more expensive than local ones, is higher costs and distorted choices. Compared, though, to many other taxes, such as a universal sales tax, tariffs are an inefficient and wealth-stifling way for governments to raise money. Yet, they're often less unpopular than other taxes because they can be portrayed as hitting foreigners. And cutting them can also be quite unpopular with vested interests, certainly because it exposes them to more competition. There is no doubt that globalisation, the reduction of tariff and regulatory barriers to trade, at least so far, has been a huge boon to the whole world. Everywhere is richer, and some countries have moved dramatically from relative poverty to considerable wealth. At least prior to the pandemic, the percentage living in absolute poverty, the global percentage, had fallen from over 30% to under 10% in the past 30 years. Likewise, the percentage not having access to clean drinking water, and global wealth had increased by as much in the past 25 years as in the previous 25,000. But because it's meant sharing the advanced technology that was once the preserve of the West, globalisation has meant equalisation too. Indonesia, for instance, which 20 years back had under half the total GDP of Australia, has now drawn almost level, even though the average Indonesian still has a far lower standard of living than ours. And then there's China. Sure, the rise of China so far has been good for everyone. Not only have 500 million Chinese people come from the third world to the middle class in scarcely a generation, the largest and fastest advance in human well-being in all history, but countries like Australia have grown substantially richer as a source of resource, energy and food security to the rising superpower, while the world has gained a stream of inexpensive but high-quality consumer goods. But in the process, the West's industrial base has been hollowed out, with large-scale unemployment in so-called Rust Belt areas, and the West's technical advantage has been eroded and in some cases lost thanks to technology transfers and sometimes outright intellectual theft. In much of the West, the middle class has been economically squeezed, grievances have accumulated, and politics has become more polarised. And now, after 40 years of bide and hide, China is asserting itself aggressively in what's at best a cold peace and more likely a new Cold War, only against a strategic competitor that's far more formidable than the old Soviet Union because it's been increasingly embedded inside the global economy and can bring economic as well as military pressure to bear against its targets. And barring a change of dynasty in Beijing, China is likely to be the challenge of the century, with big implications for economics as well as for security. That doesn't mean stopping trade with China. Of course, countries that can sell to China and can buy from China should continue to do so. It does mean, though, being much more careful about becoming economically dependent on China and about exchanges with China that have far more long-term value for them than for us. It would be most unwise, for instance, to sell technology businesses to Chinese interests, notwithstanding mutual goodwill between Chinese buyers and Western sellers, because in the end, every Chinese business is subject to the direction of the Beijing government in a way that no Western country's businesses are. Likewise, university collaborations, at least in the hard sciences, however beneficial they might ultimately be for global knowledge and understanding, probably should be seen as too much of a one-way street. As Australia has found, the Beijing government sees trade as a strategic weapon to be turned on and off like a tap, to reward friends and to punish foes. In my judgment, it should be every business's concern to minimise the critical place that Chinese intermediate goods might have in our supply chains, lest they be denied just when they're needed most. That's not to deny that, by and large, a business should do what minimises its costs and maximises its quality and its returns to shareholders. But this might be one of those instances where the long-term natural interest does not coincide with short-term economic interests, and where character is demanded of our business leaders more than just commercial savvy. In my judgment, post this disruption, countries should be conducting a kind of national audit of what's needed to maintain a reasonable life in an emergency, what they need to be able to do for themselves or should stockpile, what they're happy to trust close allies to provide, and what they're happy to obtain from the wider world because swift supply is not critical. Rather than tariffs, in Australia's case, this could mean using government purchasing to ensure that we keep a sufficiently sophisticated manufacturing base to produce essential goods at need, such as the masks, hand sanitizer and ventilators that were suddenly in critical shortage at the start of the pandemic. I am not, repeat not, advocating a retreat from freer trade, just the importance of distinguishing between countries that really are open for business and those where business is more politics by other means. Trade deals, after all, aren't just about the cost and the quantity of the goods exchanged. They're pledges of economic trust and partnership. I can't imagine that China and Australia, for instance, would contemplate concluding a trade deal today, notwithstanding the deal that my government did in 2014, which did produce a big increase in their exports to us, but an even bigger increase in our exports to them, because it is hard to trust a country that uses spurious pretexts to block our exports, to punish policy positions it doesn't like. On the other hand, Britain and Australia have just concluded a high-quality trade deal that will eventually eliminate all the old EU-driven tariffs and quotas. Despite some anxieties about animal welfare, for instance, and climate change, because both countries accept that each other's attitudes are essentially comparable and that these can be trusted to drive policy. Both Britain and Australia are eager to conclude trade deals with India, despite some different standards, because India is a democracy under the rule of law, with a well-developed civil society at arm's length from government. And it does help that India is the world's emerging democratic superpower with the potential to substitute for China in many supply chains. Now, while no Western country would weaponise trade, it does have strategic overtones. When President Obama first announced America's tilt to the Indo-Pacific, its economic arm was the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership. The idea was that a new free trade grouping among Pacific Rim countries committed to a rules-based global order would supplement a stronger US alliance presence in the Western Pacific. Regrettably, both sides of US politics subsequently retreated from this because too many American voters worried that free trade had mostly just shifted US factories to China. Now, it could be that Britain's application to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that Japan and Australia both strongly support, becomes the catalyst for the US to reconsider. A TPP that became a global economic partnership would be an important sign of democracy's willingness to work together at a time of increasing global tension. Trade does mean prosperity. Freer trade does mean more prosperity, and freer trade between like-minded countries will strengthen them in the face of whatever challenges might come. As global citizens, we should want all countries to succeed, but as supporters of democracy and the rule of law, it might sometimes be best to preference those who share our values. I want to thank the Policy Exchange for the chance to present today. I thank Liz Truss and the Ministry of Overseas Trade for the chance to be here in Britain. I also thank Dr. Handa and Worldwide Support for Development for helping to sponsor this trip.
Charles, I just want to hand over to you and just start the conversation here with our...
Thank you very much, Dean. Thank you, Tony Abbott. It's always a great pleasure to see you and to hear you. And you are a politician rare in this age who says what he thinks. Occasionally that may have caused some bumps in your career, but it's a great benefit for the rest of us. You've lived up to that today. You covered a tremendous range of very big subjects, and I want to come back to them because they're obviously the most important things. But can I be a little bit more parochial, since you are the advisor, just by beginning? You are advising our Board of Trade on how to trade in the new environment. And I wonder how you assess Britain's situation about that post-Brexit, trying to build a whole load of new trade deals and alliances.
Well, obviously it's very important that Britain does build new deals and does so as quickly as possible, and all credit to Minister Truss and to the officials below her for the work that's already been done. Basically, some 80% of Britain's trade is covered by deals of one sort or another. Many of them are simply reproductions of the old EU deals, but nevertheless a very large percentage of Britain's trade is now covered. And look, I would like to think that the Britain-Australia deal will increasingly be a model for future British deals, because it will eventually eliminate all tariffs and quotas. It will include far more movement of people for work, not welfare, and it will include much more mutual recognition of standards and qualifications. So in terms of enhancing deeper economic engagement, other than the deal between Australia and New Zealand, it's probably just about the best deal in the world.
And It's not that easy, though, is it? I mean, as a seasoned observer of these things, there are some bumps. There are problems about green demands. There are problems about a very strong protectionist farming lobby. And maybe there's a problem about the bandwidth of British negotiators, because we've had more than 40 years of not doing our own trade arrangements.
I think.
How do you observe that?
I think they're fair points, all of them. I mean, vested interests are always wary, to put it at its kindest, about any change, and there are vested interests in both Britain and in Australia. The British farm lobby, as you say, is worried about competition. I think many in the Australian financial sector are worried about competition as well. But in the end, this is where governments don't just have to reassure, they have to lead, sometimes by making sensible adjustments. And while under this deal trade will eventually be entirely tariff and quota free, there is quite a long lead time, particularly for British agriculture, to adjust.
And you were supportive of Brexit, as were several other leading Australians, probably more than any other external country, actually. How do you look at it now that it's actually happened and it's going into practice?
Well, I suppose there is a sense, Charles, in which some of the details are yet to be worked out. And there are things like the Northern Irish Protocol, which, as things currently stand, are not very satisfactory. But I'm confident that the Johnson government is going to be both reasonable and robust in its approach to the finalisation of these outstanding issues with the EU. And I also think that what we saw with the vaccination program is demonstration that Britain, as a free and independent country, can handle problems far better than it could when it needed to wait for the OK from the bureaucrats in Brussels.
Thank you. I'll come to all the great wider issues you raised a bit later, but I just want to ask Liz Truss at this point. Doing all these, you're there at the sharp end trying to do all these deals, and the Australian one must give you great pleasure. But there are a lot of headwinds, aren't there? I mean, it's probably pretty hard to get a deal with the United States. You're facing quite a lot of rough stuff from the EU about how it actually behaves about trade at this point. And because of the odd way that the protocol's done, that's not your affair, is it? So, in your department. How do you navigate all that?
Of course, Australia was a very positive move forward. It's our first from-scratch post-Brexit trade deal. And I think we've shown the posture the UK is going to take. We've moved from quite a defensive position on trade to a much more offensive position, pushing very hard in UK areas of interest like digital, services, mobility. You know, we're the second largest services exporter in the world. And we've got a huge opportunity, not just with Australia and New Zealand, which we're also negotiating at the moment, but with the entry to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Tony Abbott mentioned. You know, that's a £9 trillion area that the UK is poised to join. Those negotiations are going well. We hope to conclude them next year, and that will be a huge step forward. And of course, we continue to work with the United States. We've been cooperating on issues like aircraft and steel. We're talking about more digital work with the United States. But I think the UK has a real opportunity to become a global hub, particularly for digital and services, as well as reaching out to new partners like India, who I think are going to be vitally important to our future trade.
And what do you think about how does the argy-bargy with the EU affect that? I mean, the bureaucracy now of certain forms of trade with the EU, agri-food in particular, is very great. And of course, it's applying right now, obviously not just in the Northern Ireland question, though that's a very important part of the problem, but more broadly, so that it's pretty difficult to, if it's all on paper when it should be digital, it requires masses of forms, and a lack of goodwill, or am I being unfair? A lack of goodwill on their side.
As you correctly point out, this is Lord Frost's responsibility, and he's doing an excellent job of negotiating with the EU to achieve improvements in the operation, we're very clear there won't be dynamic alignment with the EU. We are pursuing an independent trade policy. That's why people voted to leave the EU, was so that the UK had its own regulatory sovereignty, and that's a really important principle and gives us the nimbleness and the flexibility that Tony was talking about in all kinds of areas, whether it's the vaccine development, whether it's our ability to do new trade deals, whether it's the work we're now looking at on the regulatory front as well. Having said that, in the wider trade world, the EU are important allies in doing things like reforming the World Trade Organization. They are like-minded. They want to see things like unfair industrial subsidies dealt with and the WTO reform. So, of course, I work with Valdis Dombrovskis alongside other key G7 partners to pursue that agenda.
And do you think that what's going on now, because you have to think about it all the time, even though it's not your direct responsibility, in terms of abrasive questions about trade in the EU, does that mean that we really will have to face a different way to succeed as a global trading power, or is this just a bit of politics as the new era begins?
Well, we are taking a robust approach to resolve these issues. It's in everybody's interest to make it work. We all support the Good Friday Agreement, and that is what Lord Frost is pursuing. As I've said, there is a huge agenda of global trade that the Department of Trade is pursuing. We're not short of negotiations that we're currently conducting. We've also got the Singapore Digital Agreement we're working on, which should be the most advanced digital agreement in the world. And one of the points you mentioned about trade friction, we've got a big opportunity to digitise our ports, to digitise trade, to move to digital certification, and that has been accelerated through the COVID pandemic with more activity going online. And this is why I think digital trade in particular is such a huge opportunity for the UK.
What's your attitude to China and all of this? Tony said some important things there about that though Chinese economic success had brought advantages to the world, there's a fundamental problem of trust in these exchanges, and therefore of how far we should go in opening up to China. How do you navigate that? What do you think?
It's certainly the case that the WTO rules have not proved fit for purpose, and the WTO needs to be reformed. We are not sufficiently credible in the way we deal with developing country status, for example, and the ability to self-designate as a developing country. There's also the issue of transparency. We need to see countries being much more transparent. We need much clearer rules around subsidy regimes. All of those things are things that we are pursuing at the World Trade Organization, and I'm also working with my G7 counterparts through the trade track to take those on. But one of the ways that we are building up our trade agreements is working with like-minded allies, because you're absolutely right, it's about trust. We trust the way the Australians regulate, they trust the way we regulate, therefore we should be able to sell our services and goods indirectly without having to go through extra bureaucracy, and that is different for different scenarios. So although in many ways the Australia deal shows the UK's posture and shows the types of area we're very interested in, not every deal will be like Australia, because other countries won't necessarily open up their markets. So, for example, the Canadians tend to have quite high tariffs on their dairy products, whereas Australia, in this deal, is allowing complete tariff-free access for all UK goods. So you've got to have deals where it's not unilateral disarmament, it's it's bilateral removing of tariffs and barriers, and I think that's important. And there has to be a basis of common standards and trust to be able to do that.
And do you trust China?
Well, as I've said, I don't think at present we are seeing full transparency at the World Trade Organization, and we are not seeing the rules being applied in the way they should be applied.
Would you agree that it's worse than that? That it's a sort of attempt to use trade as what in the Communist Party jargon is called unrestricted warfare. So they're trying to get into things in order, more like a Trojan horse. It's not just that they're not quite playing games of the game of transparency and so on, but they have bad intent politically.
What I think is important is that we work with our like-minded allies to challenge the unfair practices.
You're being quite careful, aren't you? So do you, what do you think about the phrase "the new Cold War"?
Well, as I've said, I believe that there are currently practices going on, particularly in global trade, that need to be challenged. I think it's right that we deal with it on a practical level. We look at what are the tools we have, and we work to improve the way the WTO is operating. And the important point about trade with like-minded allies and joining organisations like the CPTPP is we're building up trade that is trusted with like-minded allies and that supports the development of a free enterprise economy under democratic values. That is what is important to me, to expand that sphere of trade, to expand the trade between like-minded allies.
Thank you. I'll come back to Tony Abbott on this. You said in your speech that you'd done a deal as Prime Minister with China in 2014 and it couldn't be done now and shouldn't be done now. How great has been the shock? Because Australia's been more in the front line perhaps than any other free country in all of this. How great is the shock of what's happened in China's behaviour under Xi Jinping?
Well, I certainly think it's been a hell of a wake-up call. I mean, as late as 2014, when that free trade deal was finalised, we did have a very benign view of China. Now, in retrospect, it looks like wishful thinking, but at the time, we were confident that there would slowly be not just economic but political liberalisation in China. We thought there would be, over time, considerable convergence and that China would become, in a sense, more like us. Perhaps we've become more like them, in fact, in some ways, as it happens. I mean, we had Xi Jinping in his speech to the Australian Parliament even talk about China being democratic by mid-century. Now, plainly what he meant by democracy and what we mean by democracy are two different things, but the mere fact that he used the word suggests that there was a willingness to engage on China's part, which has been almost entirely absent over the last few years, and that's been reflected by a dramatic drop in the Australian public's attitude and goodwill towards the Chinese government, not towards the Chinese people, but towards the Chinese government. So look, what's caused all this? I don't think we've changed. I think the Chinese government and its actions have changed, and I suppose that has caused us to refocus on some of the things that were always true about China that back then we preferred to minimise.
It's been quite shocking, and it's happened in your country, but I know less about it. It happened here that a lot of important people and institutions have got in with China to a big degree. Mm-hmm. And you can excuse that partly if we had a policy of what was called the golden era here, that the government had encouraged universities and so on to do that businesses. But it's quite shocking how quite cheaply academics and others can be bought. And the extent, for example, to which China is inside Cambridge University and about 40 other universities in this country. Do you trust the British elites or the Australian elites to sort of see clearly about this now, or do you think there's a real struggle there for, upholding the standards of freedom?
Well, I think at every level, whether you're in business or whether you're running a university, you have to have a conception of your duty as a citizen as well as your obligation as a stakeholder in that particular entity. Now, I suppose if you're a Vice-Chancellor, at one level, the more overseas students you can attract, the better. The more funding you can get for your university, the better. But if that funding involves, in some ways, selling your soul and corrupting your overall purpose, well, it shouldn't be engaged upon. And again, I think that, at least with the benefit of hindsight, there has been a degree of naivete in our businesses, in our other institutions, as well as, frankly, a degree of greed. And this is where we need character, not just in our national leaders. We need character in all of our leaders. We need people with the character to say no, to put the long-term interest of the country ahead of what might be their short-term economic self-interest.
Do you think that's happening now in Australia, that there is the public are supporting a pretty tough line?
I think it's pretty clear that Vice-Chancellors in particular are now on notice that they've got to be vastly more careful than before. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have Chinese students. Of course we should have Chinese students, but we should be careful about trying to ensure that this is not just an intellectual one-way street where they walk away with all sorts of technical knowledge that they wouldn't otherwise have. Hopefully, they'll also walk away with an understanding of the Western way of life and an appreciation of its virtues, because if over time China is to evolve in better directions, real contact with the West, as opposed to one-sided contact with the West, will be a helpful part of that.
What do you really think, looking at the big picture, not just at Australia, what's China trying to do?
I think very deep in the contemporary Chinese psyche, at least at the leadership level, is to overcome what they call the century of humiliation, beginning with the Opium Wars and ending, they believe, with the communist takeover in 1949. I think what's happened is that Marxism-Leninism has reinforced traditional Chinese exceptionalism, and they are absolutely set on becoming once again what they see as their natural place as the world's #1 power.
Well, that's quite alarming, isn't it?
Well,
it includes military dominance, after all.
We've really had 70 golden years under the Pax Americana, just as arguably there was a golden century under the Pax Britannica. America, and before that Britain, have been benign hegemons. If China were to become more liberal, more democratic, more pluralistic in its thinking and in its ways, perhaps China could be a benevolent and benign hegemon. But I think we're a long way short of that.
Yes. When we were talking before, Hon Tony, we were sort of looking back in the last chatting before this meeting, looking back the last 40 years or so. You were speaking quite optimistically about, despite the difficulties, globalisation surviving and developing it. But aren't you perhaps underrating how badly it's gone against the sort of things that people believed were made possible during the Reagan-Thatcher era and the end of the Cold War and the opening up of the world and all of this? That to use that phrase in different contexts, there was a rather golden era for the West, and the jolly well isn't now. And why could we expect that it would return?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me if things got worse in the short term, but I'm confident that they will get better in the long term, because I think that most human beings, if they have a choice between more freedom and less freedom, will choose more. Most human beings, if they're given a choice between being respected themselves and respecting others, as opposed to being in a kind of a coercive relationship with others, will choose the former, not the latter. I mean, I think there are universal decencies in mankind that, if given the chance, will come to the fore. The question is, will they be given that chance? Now, under Anglo-American democratic systems, by and large, that's exactly what people have had. If the world becomes less democratic, less pluralistic, less liberal, I fear that we could have a worse period. But again, sooner or later, those universal aspirations will assert themselves.
But you spoke about Chinese exceptionalism, but isn't there, and you're obviously right about that, but isn't there haven't recent years brought out all sorts of other exceptionalisms, American exceptionalism, British exceptionalism perhaps with Brexit, and a general feeling that you have to assert, if you're a country, you have to assert that, your nationality, possibly even your nationalism, and that the so-called rules-based order doesn't really work, or even if it works, perhaps even more greater problem in the minds of a lot of poorer people, it doesn't work for them. So there's a disjunction between the people who rule and the people who don't, which is very dangerous in any country.
But if you look at the history of countries like Britain and America and Western Europe over the last 100 years, things have worked remarkably well for everyone. Everyone has got richer. Societies have become more equal, more fair. There has been a pretty comprehensive emancipation of minorities that would have been unthinkable a century ago. So considering the current chaotic scene, it's easy to be gloomy, but looking back, you can see a great period of progress. But that progress has been based on fundamental attitudes of respect for the other person. Love your neighbour as you love yourself. And if those underlying attitudes are absent, that's when I think we might have rather bigger problems.
Thank you. We're going to throw it open to the floor in a moment, but can I just ask both of you, in some ways, Australia and Britain are quite comparable in cultural terms, of course, and how much we share. It's so much easier to converse in all sorts of ways between most other countries. But there's another way in which we're quite similar, in that we're sort of very roughly the same size economically. And I mean, we are bigger economically, and you're bigger, you're bigger physically. But we're medium-sized powers.
I think you're underselling yourself a little bit, Charles.
No, but I think the point holds, because what I'm asking in both cases, how well can we survive if the hegemons are all arguing with one another and are not feeling very generous to the rest of us? Are we sort of caught? Liz, what would you say about that? How can Britain? It's one of the big arguments that always went on about Brexit. Now we're there. How can this medium-sized power get on in the world?
Well, I think Australia, despite the fact that it is a smaller economy than the United Kingdom, has had huge influence in the world, particularly in the world of trade. If you look at the liberalising trade agreements that were signed under Prime Minister Abbott and his predecessors and successors, if you look at the influence that countries, even like New Zealand, have at the World Trade Organization, it's that ability to show leadership that I think is important. And I think the United Kingdom is in a fantastic position being part of the G7, but also the ability to ally with the likes of Australia, with the likes of New Zealand to affect change. So I'm very optimistic about our ability to shape the debate on trade.
If I may say so, Charles, I think it has been an unfortunate feature of British public life for many decades, a slightly defeatist, declinist approach.
Yep.
And look, Britain is still the 5th largest economy in the world. It is the 2nd strongest military power of the West. Arguably, no country on earth has more soft power than Britain. And when you think of Britain's impact on the modern world, the world's common language, the mother of parliaments, the rule of law, the Industrial Revolution, the emancipation of minorities, again, the modern world has been, to a very considerable extent, made in English, and I think Britain should be quietly proud of that.
Thank you both. Let's throw it open.
Thank you. I see a number of questions up. Mary Kissel from United States. Mary, can you hear us?
Yes, I can, Dean. Yes, I can, Dean. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, please. Your question directed to all panelists, any one individual, fire away.
Thanks to Policy Exchange and thanks to the panelists. I worked for Secretary Pompeo as his right-hand person at the State Department, and we confronted many of the challenges that this panel has so eloquently and productively examined. And yet there's still a lot of received wisdom even here. The rise of China was good for everyone. We should reform the WTO, even though China won't reform it, one of the biggest members. We're still talking as if the CCP is representing the people. There's been very little discussion here about the Chinese people. This is a Communist Party state. Any kind of trade will enrich this totalitarian regime. So to the panel, what evidence do you have that this regime isn't a competitor, that it is indeed an enemy? And if it is, then how do we accelerate this move away to protect our strategic resources, quite apart from the Quad and other mechanisms? What initiatives are you pushing forward? Perhaps this is for Secretary Truss. Thank you very much.
Well, we're clear-eyed about China, and as I've said, the WTO has not had the reform it needs to have. And when it was established in 1995, I think the Chinese economy was 10th the size of the United States economy, and now we're in a very different situation. We do have to continue to trade with China. I think the question is, how do we work with our like-minded allies to affect change and to influence the future of global trade in the right way? And the fundamental principle for me is that democratic free market economies should not be undermined by the trade deals we enter or any other work we do in the trade space, whether that's trade defense or trade remedies. Our country, with our democratic free enterprise system, should not be undermined. So whether that's unfair industrial subsidies, whether it's issues in the future like carbon leakage, these are the types of things that are factored into our trade policy. But we can't forget the fundamentals, which Tony Abbott rightly referred to, which is free trade brings prosperity. And when people are more prosperous, you get better outcomes, and we can't lose that fundamental truth.
And if I could add, Mary, because you do raise an important point, we should try always to distinguish between the Beijing regime, the Communist Party, and the Chinese people, who are not our foes. I'm sure we are quite like-minded with many of the people of China. It's just that we're certainly not like-minded with the current Chinese government.
I would just like to back up what Mary's saying. Mary, I had the pleasure of meeting you when you came over with Secretary Pompeo the January of last year. And he then tried, at that time unsuccessfully, to persuade Boris Johnson to get rid of the Huawei involvement in 5G here, unsuccessfully. It was very striking. And you were very struck by it, I remember, and I certainly was. And it was only after Chinese regime had visibly made the entire world ill that Boris was prepared to think again about this. And I think it's very important to remember that, how reluctant our system, including our present government, was to deal with this problem. And I would say that this is still a problem, that there's a sort of, yes, we've got to do something, but oh, we mustn't do too much sort of feeling, which greatly underestimates the scale of the danger.
And Charles, just obviously as Thatcher's authorised biographer, she was very strong, obviously, on the picking up on Tony's point about the peoples of the Eastern Bloc in the Cold War. Then, of course, she did it in a very different period of Deng Xiaoping, a different kind of leadership, at least a different phase of Chinese perception of its part in the world. She did the 1984. You were a skeptic of that at the time, as I remember, on the Spectator. Just interested, always the unfair question to ask you as Thatcher's vicar on earth now, as is how you think she would have changed her view and because her views did evolve on many subjects, as you show in the course.
Well, I always refuse to say what she would have because I don't know. But what she did think about the Chinese regime was a couple of things. One was that it was horrible would be a word she would use freely in private, but that it was not mad, and that it was possible to do deals and make arrangements with it, so long as you understood that it was horrible, and that it was never going to be your friend. And her whole engagement with Hong Kong was about that. It was seeing that the Chinese were a great threat to Hong Kong, but taking back control in 1997 couldn't be stopped. And therefore you had to be as clear about that in the arrangements you made. The fact that those arrangements held at all was some tribute to her, but the fact that they failed also proved her suspicions right. So we had roughly 20 years after the agreement of it sort of being more or less all right in Hong Kong, and now it jolly well isn't all right, and that agreement is supposed to last for 50 years. And that perhaps is a sort of model to bear in mind when we think about where everything's going in relation to China. It is going worse and worse.
Thank you. Mary, does that answer your question? Can you hear? Can't hear. Could I call upon Latika Burke's Sydney Morning Herald?
Thank you very much, and a great discussion. My question is for both Secretary Truss and Mr Abbott. Taiwan has said it would like to join the TPP. If Britain is successful in joining, is that something that Britain and Australia should support?
We should work very closely with Taiwan. Taiwan, some years, is our fourth biggest trading partner in Australia. New Zealand has a free trade deal with Taiwan. I certainly think Australia should quite quickly look at going into a better trade partnership with Taiwan. And yes, personally, I think it would be good for Taiwan, good for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and good for this sense of solidarity between like-minded democracies if Taiwan was brought in from the cold rather more than it currently is.
I think it would be rather presumptuous of me to comment on which future members ought to be allowed into the CPTPP while we're currently in negotiations to join the organisation. But I do observe there are a number of countries looking to join the CPTPP, and I think what's exciting is that the UK will be the first new entrant since the CPTPP was established in 2018, and I think it is a big opportunity to build an alliance of like-minded free trading nations.
Great stuff. Question from Lord West of Spithead, distinguished former First Sea Lord and Security Minister under the last Labour government. Lord West.
Yes, thank you very much for that discussion, which was fascinating. And threat, as we know, is a mixture of capability and intent. And in terms of strategic trade, the Chinese capability side of that has grown and grown and grown. And I have to say they have shown intent that they intend to use it. They've certainly shown it with Australia. And I imagine when you looked at your trade deal in 2014, you didn't consider that as being an issue, but they've certainly shown it with Australia, and they've shown it in other ways. 12 years ago, I went to China as the security minister to complain formally about their stealing intellectual property from the UK. They said they didn't know what was going on and they'd stop it, and indeed they did stop it for about 2 weeks, and then it started again. So they have a real history of this. And if I could support what Charles said, Liz, I mean, I think we do need to call this out more than we are, because otherwise, they will never make them even think of becoming the, I love the word, benign hegemoth, by the way. I'm definitely going to quote that, the one that you use. We have no way of making them do that. So, for example, talking about Taiwan shows them, you know, we don't like what they're doing, and they get very nervous about Taiwan. They see that's part of China, of course. And there are other areas where we can do it. Don't you think we should be a little bit more outspoken, you know, so that they realise this behaviour, we've twigged it, we're not willing to put up with it anymore, and that actually the way we'll do it is by getting lots of allies working with us, you know, should there be a new CATO like NATO, all sorts of things we can look at. But if we don't call it out and say it, I mean, it's very, I understand as a minister being political and not saying things to really upset them, but we have got to call it as it is, I believe.
I think that's a comment rather than a question. But it's a...
We should call it as it is what I'm saying.
Well, and I think increasingly we are. We're not using the hysterical language that the Chinese official spokesmen are using. I mean, they're calling Australia chewing gum on China's boot, and you had the Chinese ambassador to one of the European countries saying that, you know, for our friends we have fine wine, for our enemies we have shotguns and things like this. I mean, we don't engage in that kind of undergraduate abuse. But nevertheless, I think we are speaking out much more strongly about where China's doing the wrong thing. For instance, there was the statement by the Five Eyes, the EU, NATO and Japan just the other day, calling out Chinese cyber attacks on a vast range of institutions, including the Australian Parliament, back in January this year. So while I take your point, it has maybe taken us too long for the scales to fall from our eyes. I think they well and truly have, and without trying to make a bad situation worse through too much inflammatory language, we are nevertheless, I think, uber realist about exactly where China and us are at.
Well, Tony is absolutely right to point to the Five Eyes statements. I think what's new, though, is the UK is now able to use its independent trade policy as part of our overall foreign policy response to issues. So in the integrated review that we launched, it is very clear that trade is a key part of that. And that is not something we have been able to do for almost the last 50 years. And to my mind, what's important here is what are the incentives? So what are the incentives to follow the rules in the World Trade Organization? How can we create groupings of like-minded countries, organizations like CPTPP, which create new areas where there is more trust, there is greater trade in areas like services and digital, to challenge some of those unfair trade practices. So what I'm focused on is what are the practical measures we can take, and that inevitably means working with our like-minded allies, whether it's the G7, whether it's the Five Eyes, or whether it's bilaterally with our close partners like Australia or the United States.
I think Alan West very rightly used the word threat and talked about it. The bit of it that seems to be surprisingly little discussed is the more directly economic side of it with the Belt and Road Initiative. If what China has done is to open up physical pathways and a series of arrangements which start to exercise control in greater or lesser forms over about 140 countries. And in particular in Africa, but by no means only in Africa. And these are very hard-nosed arrangements, often trapping poor countries in debt. And they're certainly not interested in the welfare of the people in those countries. And they're very keen on procuring raw materials. And these are of great political power and of great economic power. And it's constantly amazes me that my own trade doesn't report this more. I mean, a very good thing to do if for a great media organ would be to sort of go around and basically, for example, how many African countries are owned by China?
Or how many African leaders are bought by China?
Yes, and African leaders in particular. Yeah.
Thank you. Andrew Woodcock, The Independent. Andrew, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Thank you. Your question.
Great. A couple of questions. First for Mr. Abbott. You were saying that it was unwise for Western countries to sell off crucial businesses to the Chinese. There's an example we've got recently in Wales of a Newport wafer fab, a semiconductor business, which has been bought by a Chinese-owned company. The Prime Minister is getting his National Security Advisor to have a look at it. Do you think that that is the sort of deal which should be blocked? And also to the Secretary of State, Lord Frost is asking to renegotiate a treaty which Britain signed less than 2 years ago with the EU over Northern Ireland. He's said that if he doesn't get the renegotiation he wants, then suspending part of the treaty through Article 16 is still on the table. does that undermine Britain's position as a party which can be regarded as acting in good faith when it's signing trade deals? Does it make your job more difficult getting a trade deal? And if we do suspend the protocol, does that make it impossible to get a US trade deal?
Well, if I may start, we have this thing called the Foreign Investment Review Board, which has a pretty wide remit to examine all significant foreign investments from a national interest perspective, and pretty clearly the sort of purchase that is currently contemplated here in Britain would not go ahead were it happening in Australia. But I also think now that the PM's National Security Advisor is looking at it here, obviously Britain is moving in a comparable direction.
I commented earlier on the subject of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and of course this is something Lord Frost is in discussions with the EU about. But the way, if you look at the wording of the protocol, it is pretty explicit that this needs to be approached in a flexible and pragmatic way, and that is what we're looking for from the European Union. Both sides of this need to make the protocol work, and that is exactly what Lord Frost is seeking to achieve.
Brilliant. Thank you. Charles, did you want to come in at all? Or do you
I was thinking of a Chinese phrase that might be useful in the discussion of the protocol. Unequal treaty. That's what the Chinese always say about how we got hold of Hong Kong in the 1840s. And there was a slight element of that in those rather desperate Brexit negotiations.
Thank you. All that remains now is to call upon President Board of Trade and Secretary for International Trade just to deliver a vote of thanks. Thank you all. Fantastic panel. Liz.
Well, thank you very much, Tony, for your very interesting speech and your fantastic answers to the questions that we've seen over the last hour. It's a great pleasure to have you in the United Kingdom. As I've said, Australia is in many ways a lodestar for British trade policy. You have done such a huge amount under your premiership in Australia, but more broadly to promote the case for free trade. And you're absolutely right. When people are free to choose, they choose freedom. And we have to have confidence in our democratic, free enterprise economies that ultimately they are the economies that will generate the ideas of the future, the technology of the future, and future prosperity and happiness for our citizens. I was pleased to hear you take on any kind of declinism that you might have heard during the course of this panel, because I am, like you, optimistic about the future. But I think we've also heard a lot of realism today, that as well as being free, trade must also be fair. And it undermines the brand of free trade if our enterprises feel that they face unfair subsidies from state-owned enterprises, if they feel that they're being undercut by countries that don't abide by proper standards in areas like human rights. So we have to make sure that our trade policy is built on our values. We call it our values-led trade policy here in the United Kingdom. And the Australia trade deal, I think, is a very good example of what you talked about earlier, that trade deals are pledges of trust and economic partnership, where we work together to liberalise, to give the benefits to our citizens and businesses of free enterprise across our borders, but on the understanding that both countries are following the rules and playing by the rules. And I'm very excited about the opportunity we now have as Global Britain to play our full role, both in promoting free trade and promoting the benefits of enterprise and the benefits of competition and the benefits of innovation, but also challenging the unfair trading practices that perhaps weren't envisaged when the World Trade Organization was set up in 1995. But can I thank you, Tony, first of all, for your fantastic presentation today, also to Lord Moore for his incisive questions, although refusing to tell us what Baroness Thatcher would do today. We will get that from you later. But can I also thank you, Tony, for your service on the Board of Trade in encouraging us to be bold, encouraging us to move forward quickly, and we will continue to do that. Thank you.